I guess I'll just introduce myself real quick. So I am a scientist, a research scientist at University of Pennsylvania in the Bioengineering and Genetics department. And I have some background in grad school working on methods to diagnose viral infections. They tended to be more DNA viruses that tend to infect patients who had received organ transplants. But in the capacity that I'm doing research for COVID-19, it is using an imaging based platform to try to come up with new diagnostics and ways to detect virus in autopsy samples so that we can, for instance, learn what types of cells does it go after, for instance, in like the kidney or the placenta. And then we can start to make hypotheses over how that affects people for chronic illnesses after they're infected. So I am just going to share my screen. I put together a couple slides just to talk about the virus. And I think one thing that's important to say before I start is that I don't know everything. And I think it's okay for everyone, hopefully, as we become more knowledgeable about the virus and the infection, to be able to say that, no one's going to know everything. And it's what's kind of one of the impressive things about this whole situation is that in 4 months, we've gone from knowing about a few clusters of cases of pneumonia in China to being able to have a sequence, actually tens of thousands of unique sequences of this virus. We know exactly what causes the disease. We know we're starting to get an appreciation of how we can treat it. And there's already some candidates for vaccines. So even though it's scary and there's a lot of uncertainty, the speed at which science is moving and collaboration is moving is actually kind of impressive at least from my side of things. Just to start out, I know I was talking to people who were in art, and I'm not very artistic, but I do like poetry. So I thought I would kind of include this line from the Aeneid that goes to kind of, I think, the purpose of why I wanted to, discuss some of the things about the coronavirus, which is just that I think when we don't know and when we're in an age of misinformation, it's really easy, and I've done it myself during the past few weeks, is you get caught up in like stories about individuals or from our president who, would maybe suggest something. These things get built up and spread around on Facebook or in the news, and then that can lead to poor decision making, both on the personal level and the community level. So I'm excited to be able to talk to everybody about it. The 3 points are what is the SARS-CoV-2 virus? What is the disease, which is COVID-19? And I'm going to try to be very faithful to this terminology. So the virus itself is SARS-CoV-2, and COVID-19 is the disease. It's kind of like how we have like HIV is the virus that causes AIDS. And then lastly, how do we overcome the pandemic? So kind of talking a little bit about barriers and immunity. And my mom had sent me some questions that people have brought up. So I'll try to answer those to the best of my ability. So the virus is coronavirus. Coronaviruses have actually been known since the 1950s, and they've been known in the context of the common cold. And because of that, they were severely underfunded as a field. There were, a handful of researchers in this field. Most of us have been exposed to a coronavirus in our lifetime. They're distant cousins from what we're going through right now with SARS-CoV-2. In addition to these common cold coronaviruses, there's two other main ones in humans. The original SARS, which was in 2002 in Korea and China. And then MERS coronavirus, which stands for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus. And that is actually, there's still ongoing cases of it, but the main kind of cluster of cases was in 2012. So we have two potentially pandemic coronaviruses and now our major pandemic virus. It is pretty clear at this point that the virus was living in bats. There are hundreds of known coronaviruses in bats, and that this transmitted to a human. There's some theories going around, both, I think, made in good faith and others that are made in political kind of conspiracy theory, that have suggested that humans manufactured this virus. That has pretty much been unequivocally proven that it's not true. I included a few links and resources at the end of this that I'll send to Tara to disseminate as much as she wants to. And that kind of goes in and talks about the science of how we know that it would be extremely, extremely difficult for even the most advanced country to engineer this and put it in a human. There are other theories that it came from other small mammals, because we know that, for instance, with the original SARS, they came from civet cats, which were held in farms. So there was some kind of transmission chain between these cats, bats, and humans. And just as a note, these zoonotic viruses are becoming more and more kind of important, because as we are encroaching on ecosystems, people, especially people who are more in a farmer or hunter-gatherer type of capacity, are getting these viruses, interacting with people who are traveling, and they are getting into the global population. So zoonotic viral transmission has happened probably for millennia, but it's only now, as globalization started to take hold, that we're seeing more and more of these come to a pandemic type of level. So this virus is transmitted through the respiratory system, as far as we can tell. It's transmitted through droplets, so it's not quite, there's a bit of debate over whether it's considered an airborne virus. A lot of times with like airborne pathogens, the pathogen itself has to be able to survive in air, as opposed to with this virus, we think that these viruses are in little droplets of aerosol that are floating around, and that's why it's encouraged to wear a mask when you're in densely populated places. And that this virus is, it's fragile in some ways, so it has what's called a lipid membrane, which can be dissociated with detergent, and that's why everyone has been recommending to wash your hands very well. But it does live on some surfaces for quite a long time. So there was a study right at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States that was put out by the NIH itself that showed that the virus can live on cardboard for a day or two. It can live on sheet metal for a few days. It actually cannot live on clothing for that long. It can live on clothing for about 3 minutes. And kind of the determinant of that is the virus has water in it, just like we do, just like most living things do. And some of these materials like cloth wick away that moisture, and that causes the degradation of the virus. And I thought it was really interesting that someone had asked a question, or sent the question of, does the coronavirus mutate, and to what extent should we be worried about that? The coronavirus, any RNA-based virus, which is what the coronavirus is, mutates at a faster rate than humans or any large animal. To the extent that there's a potential for the virus to get some very bad mutation for humans, there's always a potential. But right now, this virus is extremely, what we would say, fit. Viruses don't want to kill their host too fast, because the whole point of it is to transmit and, keep spreading. And if it kills its host too fast, the host can't spread the virus to other people. So this virus is extremely fit, because it doesn't even cause symptoms in people for days, and people are shedding it. So as far as anyone can tell, this virus is at like peak fitness right now. It's still going to mutate, even if, for instance, if I was to get infected, as it's spreading through my body, it's going to mutate as it spreads through my body. Viruses are just very prone to error. But in the sense that it will have mutations in the population that cause, for instance, like more death or higher infection rate, that is somewhat unlikely. I also included a link to this really cool website at the end, which I'll just pull up, which actually shows you how sequences across the world are connected to one another. And so we can actually watch from January to the present date of how viruses that have their genome sequence have spread across the country. And they can look at things like mutations to figure out, like, for instance, most cases in the United States were from Europe, because they kind of caught on in New York City, New Jersey, and Chicago. The first cases in the US were actually from China, but they burnt out in Washington and California. And that kind of analysis is based on mutations, but these mutations don't cause any kind of disease difference. So the next thing is, sorry, I actually had a picture here, but I don't know what happened to it. So what is the actual COVID-19 disease that's caused by the virus? So COVID-19 is right now considered to mainly be a respiratory disease. That's because the virus spike protein, which you can kind of see in these electron micrographs of the virus, it has these little things called spike proteins. They're encoded by a fairly large gene. And those spike proteins interact with certain receptors on the surface of human cells. And one receptor in particular is known to interact with the spike protein very well. So that's called ACE2, if you've heard about it in the news. And that when ACE2 and spike come together, they form a complex which allows the virus to start to uncoat and then can be processed by other cellular machinery. ACE2 is highly expressed in the lung, and so it makes it a habitable environment for the virus to start to cause disease. There are other areas where this ACE2 protein is highly expressed, and one of those is the small intestine. So if you've heard in the news about people developing gastrointestinal disorders, that's likely the cause of that. And there's been research that's come out this week that shows that the virus does infect small intestine tissue. There's also been reports of kidney injury, and we know that ACE2 is expressed in certain kidney cells. And then there's some other weird symptoms called, like, for instance, COVID toes, which are these purple rashes that look like frostbite that have been appearing on people's toes. That has to deal with a clotting disorder. The clotting is actually more related to the human immune response to the virus rather than the virus itself. And actually, most severe disease is actually caused by an immune response. You might hear the term cytokine storm. So that's our body's reaction to try to squash the virus. The reason we get like a fever is to try to like squash the virus, but in fact, it ends up, in some cases severely debilitating or killing us. Oh, I think the image loaded. So this was a CT scan done by, I think, George Washington University. And this is showing kind of some pockets in green where the coronavirus is in lungs of a patient who had passed away. And then, so we know that COVID-19 causes disease in about 10 to 30% of infections, and the mortality rate is right now anywhere between 0.8% and 3%. That's highly dependent on the health infrastructure of a country and other factors. Someone asked the question, do we know, like, why is it intrinsic to the virus or intrinsic to the host of why some people get severe disease and some don't? There's no easy answer. And I think as the months move on, we'll start to get an idea of what are the main risk factors. It doesn't seem to be caused by the virus in particular, severe disease versus non-severe, because we know that there are similar like mortality and hospitalization rates across countries. One of the main risk factors does seem to be obesity, and especially in the cases of like 20 and 30 and 40-year-old people who are dying from the disease, that seems to be one of the main factors. And we know that that's a comorbidity with other things like diabetes, some like different heart diseases that we know can also cause more severe disease. And so lastly is kind of how will the pandemic end? So I think one of these kind of sayings that's been going around both in the news but also in clinical circles and on Twitter is this test, trace, isolate. So we know the countries that are doing the best right now at crushing the curve or smoothing the curve are able to test people at a high capacity, which the United States is not able to do right now. The next step, which is actually a huge undertaking, and a lot of people in the private sector are getting into, is this idea of contact tracing. So this was very successful in China because a lot of people have apps on their phones that they can walk within like 6 feet of another person. It will take a recording of that person's cell phone. And then if you test positive for coronavirus, you would press like a button on the app and it would alert everyone who you were within 6 feet in the last week or so. And so that allows people who were close to an infected person to isolate themselves. Whether they have it or not at that point doesn't really become an issue if they can then stay at home for 2 weeks. And so those are going to be key for getting the case numbers down. There's a lot of debates both in the media and in scientific circles about the idea of immunity, both like real immunity to the virus and this idea of herd immunity. So I'll just talk about that for a quick second. It seems that, so there were a lot of reports for a while, and the World Health Organization actually said that having the virus doesn't necessarily make you immune to it in the future. That was, I don't think they worded the statement right. They wanted to make sure they were covering their bases. By all accounts, if you are infected with the virus and you don't have some kind of immune disease, you will have some form of immunity to it for some time. There's a lot of ambiguity in the way I said it and in what we know, because we don't know how long that immunity will last. A lot of respiratory viruses, your immunity only lasts for months or a year or something like that. It's not a lifelong immunity. So only time will kind of tell with that. Hopefully we won't have to we'll eventually get a vaccine and people really won't have to worry about this. You may have also heard in the news about people who are getting reinfected. From all accounts, that seems to be people who had the virus, who take another PCR test. That's the PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. That's how most tests are performed right now. So they're looking for a signal of the viral nucleic acid or the viral genome. And that PCR amplifies that genome and then uses fluorescence to be able to detect if the virus is present. When after they cleared the virus and didn't have the disease anymore, they were retested, and some patients showed a positive test again. And this was mainly talked about in South Korea because they test so frequently. The South Korean government retested those people again and they were negative. And so what their kind of feeling was that it was a false positive from the testing, not that these patients were necessarily reinfected. So it does seem like you do get some immunity. I'll just quick talk about the herd immunity aspect. So Sweden kind of took this route of saying like, okay, well, let's just let people get the virus in kind of a slow moving way, and eventually enough people will have gotten it and formed antibodies that will hit some critical mass where the virus isn't able to transmit easily between people anymore. That's kind of like in theory it would work, but a lot of times one, like the Swedish people are isolating themselves. From what I've read, like attendance in movie theaters and things like that is down like to 2% of what it was last year. So even if Sweden has a good result, which compared to other Nordic countries right now, it's doing much worse, it's likely that the Swedish people are more implementing their own stay-at-home order. Um, and then just to give you an example of like a herd immunity aspect, mumps is uh, a very transmissive virus. So it has what's called an R naught value of 12, which means for every person that has mumps in a susceptible population, 12 other people would likely get it. In order for there to be herd immunity reached with mumps, 95% of the population would have to get the disease in order to protect the 5%. So it really doesn't, herd immunity wouldn't work unless we're talking about the aspect of like a vaccine where 98% of the population gets the coronavirus vaccine when it comes out, and that protects the 2% who maybe can't get it for whatever reason, like, if there's a qualifier for like being old enough to get the vaccine or something like that. So there are still some unknowns that scientists are debating, which two of the questions that I had gotten were, why are some people asymptomatic? I think I talked about that briefly, but we just don't know right now. It seems that age definitely has something to do with it, and that could deal with issues of lung immunity, or it could have to deal with prior viral exposures, and your immune system is just kind of biased to handle the exposure in a certain way. And then someone had asked this question about viral load and its relation to disease. I only put this as an unknown because there's no scientific proof to say that getting more virus leads to more severe disease, but it definitely seems that way. A lot of doctors who are working intimately with many patients who end up getting the disease have a much more severe form of it, and that's likely because they were exposed to a higher viral load. And that's the case in a lot of other viral infections, where if you're exposed to more virus, you have a more detrimental form of the disease.